Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we look to have a conversation that advances the frontier of architectural thinking by talking with people from architecture, architectural history and theory, and from a variety of other allied disciplines so that we can learn from them and rethink how we think about architecture. And that is, I hope, certainly the case today, as I take on a conversation with my good friend from University of Edinburgh, Richard Williams, who, amongst other things, has written a fascinating book on sex and buildings, which has enraptured me over for quite some time, which I read recently, and which I thought was a great topic to get into very early here in the second season of Architecture Talk. Take a look, take a listen to it, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, well, welcome to Architecture Talk, Richard. Thank you for being here all the way from Edinburgh. It's great to do a transatlantic conversation. And I am honestly quite energized to have this conversation with you because I have just finished reading this exceptional book, and I mean it exceptional in two ways. One, that I've enjoyed and loved reading it. And second is that obviously there aren't many books like this in the marketplace or even in the academy. So, Sex and Buildings, Modern Architecture and the Sexual Revolution. What a fantastic topic. And you would think there would be a lot of books on this, but I note that in the end, you have noted that, and I'm just going to read from page 192 in the conclusion from your book, where you say, where you're talking, where you're the book starts with your musings on sexuality and architecture, fin de siècle, 1900s, Freud, and then you go through a series of chapters, which we will talk about in a minute. But then in the end, you return to the early 21st century, and after quoting Esther Perel and Catherine Hakim, you surmise that revolution or not, many of the same basic questions that so exercised Freud and his followers at the beginning of the 20th century still remain at the heart of the 21st. How could, or indeed would, a healthy sexual life be maintained with the boundaries permitted for it in bourgeois society? In some ways, it is surprising, therefore, that architecture has remained so coy on this topic.
Yeah.
My case studies have been largely states of exception, and you go on from there.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a fantastic place for us to start. Sex and buildings. Obviously, every architectural building, certainly the domestic space, must inevitably inscribe sex into it. So why is architecture and more importantly architectural theory so coy about it? What is your thinking?
I don't know. I still don't know, I have to say. I mean, it's funny having this read back to me after, it's now 5 years since the book appeared. And I mean, in lots of ways, I think the basic questions are still, they're still correct. I think a number of things have probably changed. I mean, one thing that's been very live, I suppose, in the last year or so has been the certain kinds of Me Too and certain kinds of identity politics. And I think that with that knowledge, I might have recast things slightly differently. I think so, something else that was has also made me think over the past couple of years was the death of Zaha Hadid. And I think if I was to do the book again, I might try and incorporate her material a bit more. I mean, I know the discourse around her work was very much in terms of parametricism.
Well, why would you think her work particularly fits into this book?
No, I mean that's a good question. I think I think it was the sort of the later apartment buildings. So things like that big complex overlooking the High Line, or there's some very kind of sensuous designs for hotel rooms in Madrid. I think I might have included that stuff, and just because it seemed. I mean, it's obviously not. It's not things like the BMW factory or that sort of thing. But I felt that some of the interior designs seem to be alluding to sex in a way that mid-century Californian modernism seemed to do. I mean, at the same time, I think going back to your starting point, it was also pretty clear that nobody was really talking about that. I mean, in interview then with her, I mean, she was often asked about what it was like to be a female architect in a very sort of male-dominated profession, and she had lots to say about that. And then people would talk about her clothes and shoes and those sorts of things. Nobody ever really, very directly, as far as I know, nobody ever really talked about sex, and yet those there were things in the certainly the interior designs which seem to be worth talking about. So I mean,
why are we so coy, Richard?
I still don't know. Well, obviously, one answer is that I mean, I wrote this very much from my own extremely kind of boring perspective, where
boring. That's not boring. Well, is not a term that applies.
Clearly there are parts of the architectural world or the cultural world where it is. There are much more open conversations about sex, and indeed, about sex and buildings. So, one thing that what was in there in the queer spaces chapter was, there's some discussion about gay villages and sort of gay zones and cruising and that sort of thing. And we've got some, there's some work going on actually by some colleagues here in Edinburgh that is looking at cruising as a phenomenon in the 1970s in New York and other places. And their conversations are not coy at all. They have absolutely no.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that in some feminist theory and queer theory, that there is a much more candid, open, and engaged discussion on sexuality and space. Let's say,
and I think it's part of its identity in a way is that candid quality. And I suppose, I mean, I was very aware of those discourses. I mean, I think particularly the queer stuff, just because, I'm an art historian and, it's absolutely, shot through the whole discourse. So I was aware of those things, and I wanted to sort of inject some of that candid quality into a discussion of more normative architecture and culture. But, I think it just seems to be, I mean, if my colleagues who are on the cruising project, if they were here, they would probably say something like, it is just inscribed into straightness, that sex has to be coy, it has to be sort of hidden or repressed or whatever, that is the whole.
That's the norm. Yes. It's the normative expectation.
Yeah, I mean, the whole sort of Western construction of normative sexuality is that it is kept under control, or it's there's a whole set of power relations that are inscribed into it. I mean, it's still puzzling, in that I think one thing that writing the book showed up was simply that there are other areas of mainstream culture which seem to be much more comfortable in talking about sex. I mean, you can just go to any newsstand or
But let's stay
Mm,
with the sort of normative story.
yeah,
I mean, so your chapters are the care of the body.
yeah,
You begin with the care of the body, where you try and examine kind of the modernist position to a certain extent
yeah,
on sexuality, looking mostly, I think, at Lowell and
yeah,
Schindler,
yeah,
California
yeah.
houses, Reich, and I'll come back to this
Mm.
fascinating thing called the orgone
Yes,
accumulator.
yes, they're all going to accumulate it. Yeah, yeah.
And then you move to the idea of communal living,
Mm,
where you talk about various sort of, let's say, well, all kinds of things, but like the late
mm.
hippie kind of California ranch
Yeah.
communities, and contrast them and cross pollinate them with collectivist ideas
Mm,
in or lack of them in the Soviet world, and then the Jewish
mm.
kibbutz. And then you have a chapter on what you call phallic towers and
Yeah,
madmen, basically talking about, I suppose, mid-century market
yeah.
modernism, Mies van der Rohe, Seagram building, and a compare and contrast with the figure of Howard Rourke
Mm,
in The Fountainhead. Moving on then from there to what you call pornomodernism, discussion of well, the sort of Hugh Hefner and his kind of identification and invention of a certain kind of a house lifestyle
yeah,
with sexual liberation, I guess, from his perspective.
yeah. There's a weird sort of story about that chapter in that as I was writing it, actually, Beatrice Colomina and Beatrice Preciado were doing more or less the same work. It's very strange. And, we were unaware of each other, but it was actually, it was Beatrice Preciado who'd done, I mean, I think she'd worked with Colomina, but she then published a book that was very oriented around Hefner and Playboy and all of that stuff. Right? It's yeah,
Right.
interesting. Yeah.
But do you think that there is a kind of a puritanism in modernism, in modern architecture? I mean, you would think that coming out of a Victorian 19th
Mm,
century, uh, that modern architecture would explicitly have, in some way, reinscribed sexuality. And you can look, I suppose you could look at Adolf Loos's
mm,
work and how I guess the difference between the bedroom that he made for his own
mm,
wife in his own house and the very voyeuristic economy of Josephine Baker's
mm.
house, as an example. But would you describe modernism as being puritanical?
Well, that's a very good question. I I think at a certain level, I think it is, or at least the European version of it is. I mean, one thing I realised when I was writing the book was that as soon as you started to use a term like modernism, or started to talk in generalisations about modernism and whether cultures were
Sure,
puritanical or
sure.
not, yeah, you could always find examples,
Yeah, yeah, no, of course.
You
There are
could
vast generalizations here.
exactly.
I mean,
And I'm very conscious of that. And then people would then too late in a way. People would then told me stories about the Bauhaus and whatever. But there always seemed to be something. I think I would still hold to the idea that in the way that it's photographed, or the kind of images of modernism that appear in the journals, the things that are circulated, are still oddly, deracinated, or sort of they're devoid of life, and they're devoid of bodies. Really, it's very rare to find buildings used or inhabited or lived. There's something in
Yeah. Or we just have this healthy body,
yes,
like kind of
yeah,
this.
exactly. And so there is something very strong there. Whatever whatever's missing from the photographs. There's a lot of work that goes into constructing an image that's very clean. And it's saying that I feel that's some terrible cliche, but it's still there, and certainly in the way that those buildings are taught and how the image is often circulated, and the general stuff. Yeah, it's there's something that represses the body. There's something.
Yes. And at the same time, clearly there's sexual. So the Victorian repression, in a sense, continues into the modernist ethos. And at the same time, one assumes that, as in the Victorian period, all the architects who were, let's take Le Corbusier and Villa Savoye, and then we can shift to Lowell and Schindler, if you like, must at the same time obviously been inscribing a certain kind of sexuality into their buildings. I mean, think of that very display-oriented division sort of site in the bathroom of the master bedroom in Villa Savoye,
Yeah.
which. So, I mean, do you have is there where do we find inscriptions of the repression of sexuality in the architecture in modernism, early modernism?
It's it's interesting to think about it in relation to Victorian or 19th century architecture, because thinking back at it now, I started with a sense of living in a 19th century city, or a largely 19th century city, and the division of private from public space, and of it being a rather repressive space. But of course, there are lots of different kinds of 19th century architecture, and if you could easily we could have a conversation where we would perhaps be looking at the exuberant forms of neo-Baroque decoration or whatever, where there is clearly some sexuality that's inscribed. In terms of the
in the exuberant forms of the decoration
exactly,
of the 19th century.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I was in the.
Give me an example.
V&A, maybe Victorian Albert Museum.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yeah.
All
right.
There's a kind of decadence about it. Anyway, yeah. How would, if we were to work with that idea of repression, how would it be inscribed in modern architecture? I think it's. I was just looking back at the California chapter, and there's something about that the Neutra house, the Silver Lake house, which I'm sure you've been to, which when you see it in photographs, then you can imagine it as a kind of rather nice, open, friendly space, that might be very conducive to social life, of whatever kind. Visiting it and then getting a sense of what Neutra was like, and what the family dynamic was like, you have a sense of it as being somewhere where there's nowhere to hide. It's actually an incredibly controlling space, and I think that in modernism, if we were to try and look for things that are oddly repressive, it would be in that sense of control, and how transparency and openness can be means of control and discipline as much as they are ways of opening things up.
And making things voyeuristic. I mean, isn't transparency simply an alibi for voyeurism?
A lot of the time, it is. I suppose it depends on the house. I started out with a rather simplistic notion that transparency was all about voyeurism. And then
Mm-hmm.
in the end, I ended up with something that was a bit more paranoid in a way, that it was really much less about sex and much more about control. So I don't know whether that was just me getting older or whatever. I mean, but I think the those games.
I mean, those things are
Mm,
completely symptomatic, Richard, are they
mm,
not? I mean,
mm,
control and
mm.
voyeurism are both sexual
Yeah.
affects.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think clearly we over the past few years we've become everybody's become much more attuned to the relationship between sex and power. I mean, obviously they were always related, but so much of the conversation the last few years has been about that. And yeah, it's there in the architecture. I think what maybe is has become clearer is how those things are really not innocent, and that there are it's easy to approach something like Californian mid-century modernism with perhaps seeing it as a more humanized or a friendlier version of modernism, but actually it seems to inscribe all of the all of the questions of power and control and discipline that are there everywhere. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But you, at the same time, you weren't happy with the more sort of sexually positive social and experiments, such as the communal living
Yeah.
cities of California, or communes like Olympali Ranch or Drop City.
Yeah, Drop City. I mean, I found these things fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and one of the things about the book was being sort of simultaneously drawn to things or fascinated by them without necessarily being able to imagine participating in them. And I think the commune chapter was really I felt very conflicted about that one, because on the one hand there was something immensely appealing about it, and then on the other hand there was clearly there were things that went badly wrong. There were in Drop City there were certainly elements of a more really rather sort of traditional and repressive sexuality that seemed to be followed through and carried on. And there was in one of the communes that I mentioned that there's an account of the phantom fucker, if we can say that. I think this is at the Morningstar,
right at the
Morningstar
visitor,
Ranch, yes, the midnight visitor. But in this account, which was clearly meant to be funny, that almost everybody had been visited by this character, and clearly what was being described was a what we might now describe as rape, maybe, but there was something slightly disturbing about reading accounts like that, and also.
But you seem to back off very quickly from the fascination with these sites in the text, and you've identified a critical, I think, unease with the topic, which is the way you started to describe this, the communal living section, which is both fascinating and yet you could never imagine participating.
I mean, in a way, that's true of a number of things that I described. I mean, I felt with the communal living thing. I mean, I suppose if it had been a different kind of book, if it had been a more anthropological book, what I would have had to have done would have been to go and live in a commune, and that wasn't really on the cards. If I'd had longer, or if I'd been in a different life, that might have been possible. I mean, I should say that there are certainly there were things on the edge of that I had or have experienced, and so when I just before I was a student, even I had friends who were involved with the Free Festival movement in Britain, and which was basically a kind of a narco. How to describe those sort of a narco punks who organised free festivals all over, mostly the south of England, but Stonehenge was a famous one. And so I went to a bunch of these festivals. They were completely illegal or whatever, and I remember sort of feeling something of that. Being conflicted about these things. On the one hand, there was something enormously attractive about them. People could just do what they want. The music was great. There was, they were fantastic parties, but they were also. I remember, being struck by kind of how destructive they were and how kind of lawless they were, and there were aspects of that were quite
destructive in the sense that destructive to architecture and space and law and order, or destructive to people's identity?
Oh, I mean, literally physically destructive. So, I remember the Stonehenge Festival, which was 84. The last time it was on properly, and I went to that. It was, it was like being in a war zone, really. And there's this sort of great convoy of buses that wound up close to the stones. There were police everywhere on the perimeter of the site. There were the RAF, the Air Force. They were buzzing the site, and there were the nearest.
They're policing the whole place. Obviously.
Yeah, it was a kind of lawless zone. It was very, very interesting, but it was a bit, I was 17, 18 or something, and it was the first time I'd encountered something that really seemed to be completely outside of the law.
The West Coast in America, does certainly seem to carry the torch for the questioning of these sites. You can think even from the kind of busting up of hotels by Led Zeppelin or whoever, to the formation of various of these communal living communities in the Bay Area, even in LA, and certainly up in Oregon, and even here in Seattle, versus the more buttoned up, sublimated sexuality of the architecture of kind of transparency of the East Coast, of the kind you begin to, I think, discuss in the chapter on phallic towers with Mies Thoreau.
Yes, it's we'll come on to that in a second. I was the other instance of communal living that I had some experience of was in the mid 1980s. So when I was a student in London, I went to Goldsmiths, through basically to art school, and at that point in London, an enormous amount of the social housing there was squatted. So I was a squatter for about a year, and that was very interesting. So I think maybe something like 35% of the housing stock, the public housing stock, was squatted at that point, and it was complete kind of market and governmental failure, and there wasn't quite an extraordinary culture that developed around that. And it was very, very interesting, and there were elements about it that were very attractive, because we weren't just squatting houses, but also things like old cinemas, and there were all kinds of social events that were going on, and gigs and whatever. Very, very, very interesting. It was also the thing that was also kind of difficult about it was the fact that in this sort of quasi lawless zone, the people who survived the best, in a way, they were the toughest, and often the physically the toughest. So it was it became you had to be tough, you know.
No, but why do you bring this example up in the context of the sexual liberation
Hmm.
and
Oh,
architecture?
I think just because it was, you know, it was a good example of where, you know, space where lots of different things were being tried out. So and you know,
Uh-huh.
clearly, you know, sexuality was part of that, but it was, you know, it was a good example of a culture which was, you know, certainly set in opposition to the mainstream.
Right. And in the end, you also brought back the
Yeah,
Occupy culture
yeah,
of the 2000s. But and just let's
mm,
just spend one more
yeah,
minute on the 1990s. So, I mean, my experience and memory of the 1990s, it was the post
yeah,
HIV
yeah,
world where everything was extremely uh, prohibited and
yeah, yeah.
fear-ridden.
Yes, I no,
Yeah.
I think I think that's right, and I think there was certainly what, you know, one thing that I remember from that period as well was something, you know, quite a puritanical culture, sort of oddly
Yes, absolutely.
puritanical, and then I think the way that it became interesting again was, you know, very exemplified in mainstream cultures. I mean, you know, you mentioned the phallic towers chapter. Well, one of the things that got me into that, you know, apart from the, you know, the obvious architectural references, but it was the TV series Mad Men. So that was, you know, which I, you know,
Yes, yes, oh
yeah,
yes. I
me too.
watched the whole
It was,
series.
you
Yeah,
know,
with the whole
it
50s,
was
60s
it was
modernism
incredible. Yeah,
and Don Draper
it,
drinking
yeah,
triple martinis and
yeah.
having sex everywhere. So, is there an identification between 50s modernism and kind of this non-suburban male
I was
sexual freedom?
very interested in that as an idea. I mean, it seemed that what Madman was doing, you know, albeit in a, you know, complete fantasy world, it was writing something that couldn't have been reported in the, you know, the photographs, or the you know, it wasn't there uh, in the representations of those buildings in the architecture journals. It was doing something that, in a sense, was that perhaps at the level of gossip or hearsay, or, you know, bits of, you know, fragments of conversations, you know, and there was something that was maybe known about that world that was then elaborated. Um, I thought it was very clever. You know, it was. I mean, the acting in a way got, you know, the plot lines became rather wooden, but as a spectacle, it was amazing. I mean, the architecture was interior architecture was beautifully done. It was really incredible, and the
Incredible.
way that
Yeah.
it sort of it described a landscape of you know, incredibly rigid divisions between male and female, and, you know, power relations there, and then, you know, all sorts of problems with people who tried to, you know, transgress those things. No, I thought it was a remarkable piece of
Right.
work. Probably went you managed all 60 episodes, did you? I'm not sure I got that far. Yeah,
I think
yeah,
so. I think I saw them all. Yes, and they
yeah.
all end in California. You remember Don
Exactly.
Draper
Yeah,
heads to California and joins a
yeah, yeah,
meditation commune. So, thinking about the writer's conception of where this
yeah,
all finishes up
yeah.
is there. But let's spend one
Mm,
minute more on that, on this idea that the
mm,
1950s and 60s steel and
mm,
glass skyscraper with its sort of slick modernist
mm,
transparency driven interiors is uh, actually a sexualized space of a particular kind with very strict
mm,
hierarchy, of course. Uh, and that's contained and described uh, in the relationship between Don Draper and his first wife, and then the Canadian supermodel he marries, and her move to California. As a way I read all that is kind of like a shift that takes place, and with the jet plane, invention of the jet plane as kind of the car and the jet plane as the instruments that enable, I guess, essentially the mail to move from one place to the other, but in the figure of I've forgotten what his sort of second wife's name was. But it's interesting that it reads the Miesian office space in this very specific way.
I was really fascinated by that because it was so different to the way that you receive those buildings, in art school or architecture school or whatever. You're presented with these images. I mean, I'm an art historian, so I was always thinking about images as much as I'm actual buildings, but you receive those images as sort of very clean and ordered and super modern and very, very sort of masculine, efficient, rational, all of that stuff. And then you don't have to do very much to them, and you start to understand them as something else entirely. And I think that it's you can certainly understand them. I think I talked about this in the book. You'd understand them as being very masculine spaces. So having the same qualities as finely cut clothes and a Mercedes Benz or something nicely made like that. The sorts of props that Freud talks about. Pipes and coats and all this sort of robust, strong signifiers of masculinity. You can certainly understand that, but it was that sort of tipping into actual depictions of sex, actual behavior in the offices, and it was fascinating. And then of course, once you kind of got that, then you realize that there are lots of ways that landscape was being hinted at, that these buildings were understood in all sorts of ways, but in a rather kind of coded way. So there was there's that book, there's Sex and the
Sex
not
and the
that no Sex and the Single Girl, of course. I mean, there's and the I think it's like early 60s kind of a sort of advice manual for young women working in
right.
And there's lots of stuff like that, and the development of advice in women's magazines and so on. And so there was something about Mad Men that brought all of that stuff to life, and it started to fill in some of the gaps.
That's fascinating reading, Richard. This is probably a good time for us to take a break. We are talking to Richard Williams, and we are discussing the implications of his book, Sex and Buildings, Modern Architecture and the Sexual Revolution. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Architecture Talk. This is a self-supported podcast based on an initial grant from the GAHTC. For more information about GAHTC, please visit gahtc.org. We release a new conversation every other Wednesday. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, please do be sure to visit our website and to check out some of the earlier conversations. From the website, you can also subscribe to this podcast and you can listen to the other episodes. You can also simply directly subscribe to us via Spotify or via the podcast app on your iPhone. And of course, we are available to be listened. And of course, we are available to be heard via any of the other podcasting apps that are available on the internet, such as Stitcher, Overcast, etc. We would also love to hear from you if you have any questions or just some comments, or even have a suggestion for a future episode. You can reach us via the contacts page on architecturetalk.org. Thank you for listening again. Well, welcome back. We are talking to Richard Williams and we are discussing his book, Sex and Buildings, published about 5 years ago, but only now reaching my desk.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, so, Richard, if I may
Mm.
put you on the spot, you begin the book by noting that you sort of started to think about this topic in the middle of what one might describe as a typical mid-career identity
Yes.
crisis.
This was the bit of the book that got a lot of attention right at the beginning. I mean, yeah,
It
no, I
did.
mean, and I think a lot of people just read the first 2 pages and either put it down, in disgust, or or then they did read it. But it got it. No, that was definitely a kind of hook. I feel would I write that again? I don't know. I don't know. There was I mean there's a story behind it in that first of all a straightforward publishing story, and that Reaction, the publisher I'd been working with actually for some years, that they'd seen a first draft, and then they came back and they said, this is all very nice, but can you make, this is a book about sex, can you make it more more sexy? And that in a way is what happened. But I think I did. But one thing I would say about it is that what I was trying to articulate there in a very kind of clumsy way was that this was not an academic issue. This was not something that was of a rather abstract interest, but it was something that I felt actually came out of lived experience, and kind of classic experience of of reaching a certain point and having a certain kind of stability with family and whatever, and you're starting to sort of think, is this it? And
Right.
and
Right.
I remember feeling some or attributing a lot of that to the built environment. So thinking that I was in this beautiful city, good university, good job, all the rest of it, but the environment itself was somehow I felt was very controlling. I mean, I think in the conclusion, I think I say something like in the end, I realized that all the environments are controlling in some way. But I know I certainly felt those things very strongly, and there was definitely a sense when I first started thinking about the topic was it was to do with feeling some sort of entrapment, in so I mean these are
Right.
problems of luxury in a way. I mean this is
No, I understand that. No, but there are problems of luxury, but they are also kind of uh, fundamental
yeah
problems in the sense that sex and sexuality is a, um,
yeah
universal issue
and
in that sense.
mm,
And you end, since you, by saying that you, with the hope and aspiration that not much has
mm,
changed in your neighborhood, but you hope for a continual effort at
mm,
utopian thought. Architecture can't coerce people into different lives, but it can provide images of what those lives
yeah
might be like.
mm,
And I took that as the driving force behind your effort to go and look at the Schindler houses and the Neutra houses, and then to look
mm,
at all the communes on the
mm,
west coast, and then turn towards a perusal of old playboys,
mm.
and then read figures uh, in the Fountainhead. Uh, but in the end, I got the sense that
Yeah,
you were
well,
disappointed.
I think I mean my starting point was really before I'd read too much about the problem, but I knew Freud. I mean, and I'd always been fascinated by the figure of Vienna in that that work.
Uh huh.
Vienna, the
Vienna
city,
in
you
the
know,
sense of
and
Vienna of those.
the idea that this,
Yeah.
he's describing a landscape of, you know, it's not anywhere, although, you know, there's a universalizing quality about it, but, you know, Vienna, the 19th century bourgeois city, is very, very strongly present.
Yeah,
And, you know,
certainly.
I felt, you know, Edinburgh actually had a lot of those qualities. I still, you know, think it does.
Sure.
And it, so I, you know, my starting point in a crude way was that, well, you know, could there be, you know, could there be liberation in some form? You know, could there be a non-repressive way of being in the world? I think where I ended up through doing a lot of reading and then looking at stuff was something that's much closer to the you know, Michel Foucault's account of sexuality, where you understand Foucault,
Whose account again?
Michel Foucault, where you
Foucault,
understand sexuality as
Yeah.
something that is it's biological, but it's really the interaction of the biological and the social, and you know it is the repression is really it's a hypothesis, or it's a myth rather, not a hypothesis, that it's
Right.
it's something that gets produced as an idea in certain circumstances, but actually sexuality is something that is socially produced, and you know sometimes it, you know, it may have very florid manifestations, and other times not at all. So I ended up with, you know, a view that's much more like that. You know, having started with a much more kind of biological view. So
Yeah.
really moved from the
Yeah.
biological to the social, and I think, you know, it's partly just through having read a lot more and, you know, got a bit older and looked at a lot of things, and I do, you know, now, you know, looking back at the whole project and having written a little bit more about the topic, I think that I would subscribe to that much more. But, you know, still kind of fascinated by the idea of liberation. It's
Yes.
and I think that one thing that's encouraging in the, you know, really very, very recently, but it's I think people have started to talk and think about housing a lot more, at least in, you know, the kind of, you know, rich world that I inhabit, and it's, you know,
And
Yes.
Hayden, you talked about Dolores Hayden and her interest in. Yeah.
Very interesting bit of work there, and you know, her work on co-housing was, I mean, it's quite a dry piece, but I mean, it's extremely suggestive, and it's interesting how, you know, even in at the moment, in, you know, even in places like the UK, there's an increasing talk about co-housing or co-living solutions. You know, things that look much more. You know, at least they start to break down the conventions of housing a little bit. I mean, you know, maybe some of these things.
And their inscription of a certain
Yeah.
kind of a nuclear family. I think is that the critique, with its expectations of a certain kind of
No, I think that's right,
and by liberation here we are talking about,
Yeah.
you know, sexual liberation as kind of a key indicator of a transformed
yes, I
sociality.
think
Is
so.
that what
Although
you're talking
I
about?
think one of the things that has certainly been happening with housing around co-living is the production of a new market sector, which, you know, clearly is going to enable over the next few years in, you know, big cities here, and I'm sure in the US as well. It'll enable youngish people to live together in, you know, non-nuclear family settings. I mean, all of that seems to be positive. On the other hand, it does seem that people are now working so hard that they really have no time for any kind of, you know, that sexual liberation does seem to be off the agenda altogether at the moment. But
Okay, so let's take this opportunity to also, I mean, you picked up Vienna and Edinburgh and sort of put them down together. But you do have a section in your book, a little section in your book, but I know from some of your other writing your interest in looking at other sites,
Oh yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
Brazil. And then, you looked at the love hotels in Tokyo, in Japan, as possible sites of alternative, I guess,
Yeah.
sexual
I
socialities.
mean, I think I've done, I suppose, quite a lot of work over the years on places that are really the complete opposite of the 19th century European city. So, Los Angeles is a place that I've very often been to, and I like a lot. And
Yeah,
I did this big, as where we first started talking, this big chunk of work on Brazil. And again, I think the way that,
right.
that Brazilian cities were talking about themselves, and some of the wilder architecture they were building in the 50s and 60s did seem to at least provide an image of a different kind of life. And I met Oscar Niemeyer before he died. I mean, he must have been about 110 or something. God.
Yeah.
And yeah.
As is IMP, by the way, he's 102.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a good profession. No, you're in the right profession. You'll live forever.
I guess so. Yeah.
And a certain kind of quite sort of normative sexuality was a big part of what Niemeyer was about, and what he was doing. Well, what did he?
What do you mean?
The
What do
way
you
that
mean
he
by
talked
that?
about his
Yeah.
buildings, he would say, "Oh well, in the morning I do a few sketches, and then I like to go down to the beach and draw the girls or whatever." And his whole life seemed to
Yeah,
he cultivated this idea of just hanging out on the beach and meeting girls, and and obviously there are those famous drawings of buildings where they're he equates them very directly or to female form or whatever.
right.
So and yeah,
Which is also true of
well,
Corbusier
there's
and some
obviously
of
a
his
lot of overlap
translations.
there, and Corbusier. And I wrote about this in the Brazil book, before, which where I mean Corbusier just becomes completely entranced by Brazil and disappears for a while, and his architecture takes on a very kind of sexualized turn. And it clearly, all of these people, I mean Corbusier and Niemeyer and all the other Brazilians of that generation, they were trading in myth and fantasies and whatever. But it was very interesting how they consciously wanted to inject that into their kind of modernism. Of course, I mean they were doing that at the same time as other Brazilian architects like Villanova Artigas were doing things which were really not about that at all. I mean they were about politics and struggle and class, social class, and
Of course. But let's stay with that for 1 second. I mean, our big figures of architecture are dominated by a certain masculinity, and with masculinity, a normative sexuality. Corbusier, Niemeyer, even Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe. You can go down that line. And Louis Kahn, I suppose, with the fantastic film.
That's an amazing film. My Architect. Extraordinary.
Yes. I mean, there is this. The figure of the architect as invented by these quote unquote master figures and idealized as, for instance, in the person of Howard Rourke, in both in the film and the book, as a kind of an aggressive male figure, is not a figure that seems to have gone away even today. I don't think there has been any shift on that. Looking up and down the pantheon of our
it's
star
very strongly
architects.
present there, isn't it? And it's in the look of architecture studios of the offices of the big firms. It's there in the way that architects like to have themselves photographed and present themselves to the public. I mean, it seems. I mean, in a way, I think it's probably why I didn't become an architect. Yeah, it's very, very curious thing.
Yeah, and it remains unquestioned. I mean, it's amazing to me that that this isn't a stronger
Yeah,
discourse
I mean,
even in the
I think
academy.
since the book was published, it has become, a significantly stronger line of questioning. I mean, I went about 18 months ago. I went to a conference in Stockholm, which was it's the Architectural Humanities Research Association, which is a sizable conference, and that was really all about this question. So it was all about architecture and gender. It was called Architecture's Feminisms, and yeah, I mean there was a lot of work there that made me think, you would have written a different book now. But I mean, clearly they were, the organisers of the conference were writing and thinking very much in opposition to what they saw as a mainstream culture, and architecture being a particular problem. And yeah,
Right. I mean, we consider ourselves to be a, at least academically or even in general,
Yeah.
a very progressive liberal profession,
Yeah.
where we are all over
Yeah.
sustainability, we are all about ecology, we are all about
Yeah.
social society, social housing, equality,
Yeah.
social justice, you name it. But somehow, I don't think feminism or seems to have made a big
it is a
dent.
very noticeable difference between architecture and art history. So I mean, I've always lived in the art history world. I mean, for better or worse, it's a funny old discipline. But a very striking difference there is the fact that
Right.
gender politics, feminisms of different kinds are absolutely core to the curriculum. So even us, we're a big department. We're lots of people doing different stuff, but I mean, most people have got some kind of interest in the body, as an idea or a problem.
Correct.
And then in terms of the just as a professional organisation, we are, I would think, about 3/4 female now, I think. So it's something like that. So it's almost the exact opposite, And even though we have, it's interesting to see that actually played out in architectural history. So although I'm basically an architectural historian in lots of ways, but I inhabit the art history world. But you do see that those gender patterns played out in the architectural history world. So yeah, our architectural historians are mostly men, even though they do basically the same thing as the architectural historians. Yeah, no, it's curious.
Yeah, as we move towards the end, I do want to come back to James Bond. If there is an archetypical masculine image that parallels and certainly eclipses the Harvard Rourke of Fountainhead, it would be Mr. Bond. And I'm fascinated by your discussion of the, what is it? It's the Lautner's.
The Sheets Goldstein house. That's the one up in the Hollywood Hills, which I think LACMA now own. There's the other one, which I've now forgotten the name of, but the one in Palm Springs is the one that's in the Bond film. So the Sheets Goldstein, Elrod House, that's it. Elrod, 1968. That's the one that's in the Bond film. Yeah, so there's two houses. Yeah, they were fantastic to visit, both of them. Extraordinary house.
Why were they fantastic?
Yeah, why were they fantastic? Well, kind of just in spatially, they were quite extraordinary, both of them. They had the most surprising spaces. They were totally baroque. You couldn't, you would sort of enter, and you didn't know what you were going to experience. And then suddenly you sort of enter through some very sort of small and discreet entrance, and then the house would kind of explode into, in the Sheets Goldstein case, it's all organized around an enormous pool, and then the Elrod house has this gigantic circular living space. I mean, they're spatially they're extraordinary. Then in material terms, they're also extraordinary. So there's a kind of richness of the materials, of the surfaces. They're just consistently surprising, funny houses.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mm.
I mean, what jumps out for me is that it's always, it seems like the villains who seem to have modernist houses.
Yeah.
You assume that the villains are all, sexually promiscuous.
Goldfinger, the Bond book. I mean, originally Ian Fleming book. The Ian Fleming modelled Goldfinger, the great villain, on the architect Goldfinger. I'm sure you know that story.
Yeah.
So, Erno Goldfinger. Yeah, that's where he got the name from.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Really?
I think he liked the idea that Goldfinger, the architect, was this, mysterious Middle European immigrant, and
extremely polite and well-spoken and suave, but at the same time, an absolute villain. Ruthless villain who uses architectural contraptions to get rid of people, like trapdoors and things like that. And I also think of the entire visual staging of the Star Wars series, the original, where the entire empire has exquisite modernist architecture, ships and its staging, whereas the rebel forces look like Lego.
Those things they're important, aren't they?
Why is it that the villains get identified with exquisite modernism?
I don't know. I suppose maybe in the popular conversation around architecture, then it's easy to see modernism as exemplifying control and discipline, and I don't know, things that are maybe coercion, things that are really easily associated with villainous behaviour. I don't know. And then, I guess, well, this would be another conversation, but there was enough in the popular domain by the 50s about architects being eccentric and controlling.
My sense in some conversations here in the United States is that architects have the reputation of being, suave, sophisticated, always with a different point of view, and the figures who stand around immaculately dressed at parties with cigars in their hands.
Well, it hasn't changed. I've just been to the Venice Biennale, the architecture biennale, and of course it was James Bond, really. It was like a James Bond film. Yeah.
The Biennale was James Bond. All right. Well, on that note, thank you for being on Architecture Talk, Richard.
But a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash. I am the host of the show, and our show's producer is Elizabeth Umbenhauer. If you like the show, please do remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And also take a moment and rate us on iTunes. Thank you very much, and see you next time.